Everybody needs advice at times. Maybe you have medical problems, so you go to your family doctor to get advice. Maybe you have financial questions and you need some questions, maybe even about investments. So you go to either Edward Jones or maybe even E.F. Hutton, because when they speak, people listen. And then if you have other difficulties, like say you're going to college and you're looking for advice on what classes to take, then you go to a faculty advisor and they give you some advice. Just a word to the side, I've had 2 different faculty advisors and both of them gave me just the opposite advice I needed, but we'll leave that alone. That's probably true for many of the people in all categories who give advice. Well, especially like this one couple who just a few weeks ago was tired of being at home for a year with their own family, trapped in their own house because of the pandemic. So they in California were finally released and able to get out among people and civilization. One of the first places that the couple went was to a marriage and family therapist. They'd been trapped in their house with the 4 kids. What do we do? Would you please help us? So the Christians went for advice, and they went to a Christian family therapist, and she gave her best advice. Put on all this clothing and go over here to this place for smash therapy. So they all went in there and grabbed a bat and got to choose what object they would like to beat to smithereens, and one was a computer printer. So this was their way of getting advice and relaxing their tension, was to beat these objects in the room. Well, sometimes the advice we get is not the best, and even crazier, those were all Christians in that story, and they were interviewed and put publicly the information. Now, where do you go when you want advice? Let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's say a crisis were to take place in this church. Who would you call first? Our insurance agents insist we call them first so they can protect themselves. But you know, the lawyers also want to be contacted first because they want to come up here to get any evidence. But then again, the police want to be called first because they want to protect other people in case people are getting harmed. Then 911 wants to be contacted first because you should be calling them first. And then the church leaders would like to know, maybe we should be contacted first so that we can know who to contact next. And if children are involved, maybe you should contact the parents first. And you say, that sounds like an overboard moment. Well, no, it isn't. We all need to know where we should go to for advice, and we need to know who to go to first. You know, that episode took place for me 16 years ago. A year before I came here to Ohio, I'm driving down the road. I see this man in a pickup truck trying to chase this dog. And you can see the dog is still carrying the leash. The leash is dragging behind the dog. So I thought I'd be a hero. I pulled up my car next to the dog and reached down for the leash. Well, he must have been hungry because he took a big bite out of my hand. I didn't have enough sense to ask the owner, who was right there and grabbed it and took off. I didn't have enough sense to check the license plate of the vehicle. Well, did the dog have rabies or not? Did it have shots or not? So I call up the police. What do I do? And then I go to the hospital. They gave me the battery of shots, 11 of them. I had to find different places on me because they can't give all 11 in the same location. Okay, everything's fine. They said, don't worry about a thing, because when people have their dog licenses, they have to pay the $40, and it's out of that money that they pay for these disasters and these shots. Then I move here to Ohio a year later, and I get a bill in the mail, $3,000 for all these rabies shots and all these other shots. And I called them out, hey, you guys said it was paid for and all of this, the county was paid. And they said, oh, well, there was one thing we didn't notice. You didn't call us first. Because you didn't call the county office first, you have to pay the $3,000 for the shots. I'm going, huh? So sometimes it does pay to call the right person first. And this is a huge lesson for us today, because we all have moments of needing advice, and we need to know who's the best person to go to, and where do we get that advice? Maybe your Bibles are still open to 1 Kings chapter 12. It is in this passage that we will see how a king makes a royal decision. I can't imagine being a king or leader or president or governor and just making decisions like all day long. People come in, you got to make them instantaneously. But we see something really wise in the king here, so let's look at it. In the first 5 verses, we see that King Rehoboam encountered a situation needing advice. So here we go with verse 1. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, a city north of Jerusalem a little ways, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard of it, he was living in Egypt, for he was yet in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. Then they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father in his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. Then the king said to them, and this is really wise, he said, depart for 3 days, then return to me. So the people departed. He made at least one wise decision. He said, I can't answer that one quickly. I understand that one fully. It's difficult for people with my personality type to answer questions in less than 2 days. I got to think about it, chew, and go over it. So he said, come back in 3 days. And what was the situation? A decade or two previous, Solomon was the king. God was raising up all these people against him because of all of his lustful, selfish passions. God's bringing all these antagonists to him, and one of them was a guy named Jeroboam. And the tension between Solomon and Jeroboam was so great that Jeroboam had to leave and go hide in Egypt lest he be killed. Well, now that Solomon is dead, Jeroboam's coming back. And Jeroboam has already been given the word from the Lord that he would be a ruler in Israel someday. So that's all in the background, and now we have this episode taking place. And now we have Rehoboam, the king of all of Israel, in need of making a decision. I'd like to put a pause on the message right now and have us to think about where should we go for advice. We've already mentioned a few already, but in relationship to our Sunday school lesson as well, this is such an ideal topic. Where should we go for advice? Let me give one example. The Ohio Northeast School of Theology, the school started within our association, the one that I lead, is going to put on a class this fall. It begins in 2 months from now. It's going to be on counseling. I've already received word. Someone leading that must have a licensed degree. You need to have a master's of counseling. You need to have all this experience. You need to be qualified. You need to be certified, bona fide, I don't know, homogenized, pasteurized. I don't know how many other things need to be provided to teach a class. So what really is needed to be wise in these areas? Do you have to have a college degree? Do you have to spend at least 20 hours on the internet studying what's on the internet because supposedly that's where all the knowledge is? Do you really have to be licensed by the government to give advice. When you leave today and you ask someone, where would be a good place to eat for lunch today? Remember, you can't ask the average person. It has to be someone with a licensed degree from the state of Ohio telling you where you're permitted. Really? Think we are really enmeshed in this mindset more than we realize. Where do we go for advice? Well, let's go back to the passage and we'll dig further into the applications. King Rehoboam sought advice from two different sources. And as we'll notice in this passage, he goes to only two. He doesn't go to the only two ever, but he chooses to go only to two sources. He could have gone to 1,000. The first source is in verses 6 through 8. Here he sought advice from the elders. So in verse 6 we read, "The King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, 'How do you counsel me to answer this people?' They spoke to him, saying, 'If you will be a servant to his people today, we will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them. Then they will be your servants forever.'" And these elders were great people to ask for wisdom because they lived during the reign of Solomon. They saw what was going on. They saw the heavy taxation. Can you imagine? 7 years it took for 100,000 people to build the temple. The expenses that went with that, but even more than that, Solomon spent something like 12 years on his own palace. Now, have you ever thought about this? He had about 1,000 wives. They didn't all live in the same room. They probably had different houses as well. Can you imagine having to buy a house for 1,000 wives? I mean, think of all the expenses that are accumulating because of Solomon's lusts. And the people are saying, we can't take this taxation much more, this heavy, heavy burden. The elders who lived during the time of Solomon knew that. But now look at this amazing aspect that follows in verse 8. Rehoboam forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given. Notice he did not forsake it after hearing what the other people said. He's already forsaken it. He already made up his mind what he wanted to hear from them, and when he didn't get it, he just moved on. He already had his mind made up. God wants us, when we seek advice, to come with an open heart, not with preconceived ideas, and this is what I really want. You know, sometimes people read the Bible that way. They're looking for a verse to justify their behavior, and God wants us really to go to him with an open heart. Let's now look at the next aspect in the second half of verse 8 through verse 11. Here, Rehoboam sought advice from his friends. In the middle of verse 8, we see that he consulted with the young man who grew up with him and served him. So he said to them, "What counsel do you give that we may answer this people? Who have spoken to me, saying, 'Lighten the yoke which your father put on us'?" The young man who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, "Thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, 'Your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us.' But you shall speak to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" What a different set of advice from his young friends. This past week, for whatever reason, I encountered this situation multiple times. I saw one girl who was pretending she's getting her picture taken, so she gave this pose. And I see that often, and I didn't know what it meant. I'm thinking back at the Richard Nixon era. That means victory. You go to the 1960s, it means peace. Many people get their picture taken of athletes, and they're pointing number one as if to say, we're number one. Some say one because Jesus is the one way. And so I'm just asking a curious question, but I accidentally worded it a little bit differently. I said to her, you know, my generation didn't use that symbol when getting photographed, but many in yours do. What does that mean? To which she said, we don't ask your generation what you do when we don't understand. And I'm thinking, whoa, where did this come from? And the one that bothered me the most was a guy who was in this building just a few days ago to look at something that might need to be repaired. I gave a very simplistic comment about the Lord and asked the question about his relationship with the Lord, and he didn't say a word, but turned his back and walked away, went straight to the door, and then snapped with some comment, I told you I went to church when I was a kid. The hostility of young people towards the adults, and I might need to put a pause there, they've learned that from my generation. They've learned not to seek the true source because, unfortunately, my generation has not been teaching them the right place to go for truth. These young people in this passage are saying to King Rehoboam, you let them know who's really boss. We live for ourselves. We do what we want to do. So now we come to verses 12 to 14. King Rehoboam has heard the advice from the elders. He's heard the advice from his friends. Now, what is he going to do? We see that King Rehoboam made an unwise decision in this passage. He made an unwise decision. For verse 12 says, then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. The king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. I got to thinking this week, how did Rehoboam grow up and see life? Is it possible as he grew up, people were constantly slapping him on the back saying, boy, aren't you privileged to be a son of Solomon? He's a great, well, there will never be another king as wise as he is. Well, there will never be a king as great as he is. Boy, aren't you so fortunate to have him as your dad. No other king will be better than he was. Maybe he heard that. And maybe he became someone indignant and wanted to fight against that. So when it became his time, he's going to say, you think my dad was great? I'm going to be even greater. If he can be great by taxing people, I'm going to make it even worse. Maybe this attitude of total selfishness, I want for me. Maybe that's what drove Rehoboam to make this very unwise decision. You know, this decision and aspect, the mindset reminds me of Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia during World War II. We sure hear a lot about Adolf Hitler's bad behavior, but we rarely hear about Joseph Stalin's. He was just as wacko and crazy. Because he was crazy, he didn't want the world to know about it. So he put every one of his friends, or anyone in his family or acquaintances who knew him from the years past, he had them all to be arrested so nobody would find out that he's crazy. He put all of his family members in prison. And all of them, except for the last one, cried out to him, oh, Joseph, baby, oh, please, why are you doing this? Please let us get out. In every case, when they whined, Joseph Stalin put them in a more severe punishment and a more severe prison. The last person was his daughter, Svetlana, and she said, I'm not going to follow my family's footsteps. She's the only one who didn't complain, and she was able to survive the war because she was in a minor prison. Stalin doesn't want anyone to know about him. He'll do whatever it takes. I kind of see that in Rehoboam. I also see that in a king named Xerxes who lived 1,500 years ago. A wealthy governor came to him and said, "Oh, great king, I would like to donate 3,993 derricks of gold to your great army." And Xerxes was so flabbergasted. No one had ever given him anything before. Wonder why? And God specifically mentions in the Bible, don't give anything to rich people because you're doing it for manipulative reasons. But Pythias, the wealthy governor, didn't know that passage. So after he gave the money and saw the king was happy, he said, "Oh, by the way, would you please spare my son from going to war?" The king became enraged. "How dare you make a request of me? I am the king." He ordered the son of Pythias to be brought before him. They cut him in two and placed each half on each end of the gate and had the entire army march through. This is the mindset that I see of Rehoboam. I'm greater than my dad. And if it means hurting and abusing other people, I don't care because I live for me. Now let's go to verse 15. There's one extra verse I want you to see which shows God's sovereignty and our freedom to choose do not contradict. God's sovereignty and our freedom to choose do not contradict. Some people classify themselves as Calvinists, and they spend their time over here talking about God is sovereign and completely in control of everything, and we don't have a choice. But then you go to the opposite extreme, and you have some people over here who say we have all free choice, but God's not involved. The truth is both. And there's no way for us to figure it out. But look at what verse 15 says. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord. That's where you might think there's conflict here. How can God be in charge and at the same time allow Rehoboam to make his decisions? And the answer is because God is so totally all-knowing and so powerful, he knows how to work with our freedom of choice to accomplish his sovereign will. So let me start over at the beginning of verse 15. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord, that he might establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Actually, this verse is a type of key verse for the next several weeks. We've already hit on this idea before. But as you go through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, every time kings submitted to the Lord, to love the Lord, things went well. But when they chose to have fun or do something selfish, things went bad. When things take place in America, or in Ohio, or in Mahoning County, or in your household, God allows every event to move us to that point where we will return to him or enjoy him more. God is behind everything. He's sovereign. He doesn't initiate evil. But he allows evil, especially when we choose it, so that his ultimate will take place. We're not going to look at the next passages, but if you start with verse 16 and following, you'll see many consequences that came because of that decision. For starters, 10 of tribes out of Israel just left. How's that for humbling? You're the king, you're going to show them how tough you are, and you make an unwise decision, and 10 out of 12, 5 out of 6 leave your kingdom, and now you're left with a minuscule little place. Not only that, but people began invading. The Egyptians came in and took a lot of the gold and possessions and took that back to Egypt. I mean, the problems just multiplied. And even worse, the 10 tribes who left refused to worship the true God, so they just came up with their own gods or copied those of their neighbors. I'd like for us to look at this passage again from an application perspective. Where should we go for advice? And if someone reads just this passage alone, it would be easy to say, well, we go only to 2 people, to senior adults and to young adults, and we always listen to the senior adults. I've heard that message in Bible study conclusion many times. But that's not what the passage is saying. It's saying Rehoboam chose to go to 2 places only. But he never went to the true source of wisdom. Our source of wisdom is God alone. So the next blank on your bulletin insert is we are to go to God. He is the number one source. We all know this in our heads. But if any of you leave here today the same way you came in, I didn't do my job or something like that, I want to push you one extra notch or 2, one extra level of maturity, whatever the wording is. When you're sick, who do you go to first? The God of this universe says in James 5, when you're sick, you are to go to the elders of the church first. If we don't, we'll probably get a bill for $3,000 saying you didn't go to God first. Where do you go for advice when it comes to finances? Well, we don't need to. Every time we need something, just go to the bank and borrow more money. Just do what everybody else does. Do we ever stop to say, God, what is your will? He may have something totally different in mind. He might want to give you that object for free. But if you choose not to follow his advice first, you'll probably get a bill for $30,000 to buy that object because you didn't seek his advice first. Not only finances, it could be anything, even counseling. This is one area that is just amazing, that is truly, purely to be resolved in the world of God. I've stated many times, and I'll even add the phrase, this is my perspective, but I believe I have plenty of Bible verses to prove it, that every single solitary mental illness is because, or let me word it this way, every single mental illness is curable. Let me word it that way. It's in the Bible. David said, bless the Lord, O my soul. What's his soul? He's not talking about his foot or his head or his hands. His soul is his mind, his will, and his emotions. And the verse that follows says, who heals all your diseases. He restores our soul. What Christians, the vast majority of Christians do not go to the Lord for solutions other than generic prayer, God help me. As I am preparing for the class on counseling, I've just come up with some amazing stuff. The list of ways that worldly people try to solve problems is longer than this. It's not just smash therapy. There's even astrological therapy. Well, it depends on which month you were born in and your zodiac sign that determines which way you respond. That's being taught out there. Then there's another approach that's very common. They take electrodes to your brain and they zap you. I'm not joking. That's called shock therapy. There are many other approaches, crazy approaches out there. And you think, well, I'm glad that we go to a Christian college. If you only knew. I opened up a book one time that showed 16 different approaches being used by Christians. You show up for Christian counseling, you have no clue which one of the 16 or 50 different ways that Christians are using. And the majority of them are not starting with God. There's another approach, this is a smaller category, called biblical counseling. Even that one has numerous subsections to it. One's nouthetic. There are other groups within it. The point is, we're supposed to go to God first. And people who don't want to and choose another route, they get even worse than a $30,000 bill for not going to God first. You know, we've had people within our midst inside these four walls, if you'll permit me to say four, those are kind of different shaped. Within this building, within the last 15 years, we've had people who have actually chosen to seek the Lord first and had amazing results. One guy attempted suicide. Okay, attempted suicide multiple times. He hated life. But he made one decision, and all of a sudden his life changed, and he was happy. Another person, whom you all know, most of you, really severe problems to the point of attempting suicide multiple times. I said to him one day, would you like for this to end? And I get the same response every time, this weird, what's wrong with you? That's impossible. That's just voodoo. No, if you won't help, you need to go to the psychologist and the psychiatrist. There we go again. Don't go to God first. Let's go to these worldly scholars on planet Earth. I've seen it over and over and over. Multiple people who are in situations so bad that the worldly psychiatrists say there is no hope. And it's such a joy to laugh at the psychiatrists afterwards when God sets them free. Completely, 100%, totally, in an instant, no time for healing and coping, and it's over with. 100% over for individual issues being addressed. My God is greater than everybody, anybody, any doctor, anybody. He is worthy and holy. Will you go to Him first? If you have issues, the only thing we could probably do in a mature way would be, would you guys pray for me that I hear from the Lord? But if we complain, we're actually saying, I don't want to go to the Lord to get a response. I enjoy my pity party and enjoy my miserable life. I just want you to join me in my misery. God is big. He is great. And just as the lesson in Sunday school this morning said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He is the source of all hope, all joy, all peace, even when we live a life like Job's. We can honestly say, I know my Redeemer lives. I can say, though He has tried me, I will come forth as gold. And as he eventually says, I have heard of thee by the hearing of mine ears, but now my eye sees you. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. You are worthy, and I have no right to ever whine and gripe and complain at you. Why? Because God is the source of truth. At the very bottom of your bulletin insert, you'll see that it says, the beginning, the true source of starting is leading people to truth. When they are brought to truth, the God of this universe says, you will know truth, and truth will set you free. You have a choice today. Are you going to check out other human advisors first? Or are you going to go to God first? God is big, and he anxiously awaits your presence.